I shall express my affect fearlessly and ruthlessly in what follows, and I shall answer injustice with injustice, that I may learn to know why and to what purpose Job was wounded, and what consequences have grown out of this for Yahweh as well as for man, writes Jung in answer to Job. It is all one, therefore I say, he destroys both the blameless and the wicked. When a scourge brings sudden death, he mocks at the despair of the innocent. These are the words of Job, as recorded in the 9th chapter of the book that bears his name. They are words of profound crisis, spoken from a place of unbearable suffering. They cry out from one of the most essential and challenging questions humanity has ever posed. What is the nature of the divine power that governs our world? The book of Job stands as a monumental answer in the long historical development of this question. It is more than a simple fable about patience. It is a profound psychological drama, a raw look into the character of God, and in doing so, into the evolving consciousness of humankind. To explore it with honesty is to start a journey towards deeper self-knowledge, seeking an understanding that can hold the immense and often terrifying complexity of life. Our aim here is one of illumination, to carefully distill the wisdom embedded in this ancient struggle, because it is strikingly similar to our own struggle. Before we proceed, it is essential to understand that the names Job and Yahweh are vessels for experiences that are deeply and universally human. Job is the archetype of the good person who suffers unjustly. He is the part of every one of us that has acted with integrity, only to be met with devastating misfortune. He is the cry of why that exists through every life. And Yahweh is the name we give to the overwhelming, paradoxical power that so often governs our world. He is the logic of the storm, the beautiful and terrifying nature of a reality that can seem both intimately personal and coldly indifferent, both creative and destructive. This story then is a mirror, and in it we are invited to see the reflection of our own deepest struggles and to find a key to navigating them. The journey begins with the central actor of the drama, a figure who is not Job, but his ultimate counterpart, Yahweh. Before we can comprehend Job's trial, we must first attempt to understand the psychological landscape of the being who initiates it. Carl Jung, in his masterful study, Answer to Job, presents us with a provocative and controversial portrait. He observes that Yahweh is a being of total and absolute power, the creator of all that exists. And yet this all-powerful creator appears deeply troubled, possessing a character filled with earth-shaking paradoxes. Jung also involves us when he writes of Yahweh's relationship with his human creations, noting that God could get inordinately excited about their perceived failings, without ever considering that in his omnipotence he could easily have created something better than these bad earthenware pots. This simple, almost rustic metaphor opens a profound line of inquiry. It shifts the focus from the flaw in the pot to the nature of the potter. Before we delve deeper, we must accept a crucial limitation. As Jung himself notes, what we are sketching is no more than an anthropomorphic picture which is not even particularly easy to visualize. We are using the limited tools of human psychology to wrestle with a mythological image of the divine. We do so not to claim we have captured God, but to better understand the human psyche that created and was shaped by this formidable and paradoxical image. It invites us to consider the psychology of a creator who appears dissatisfied with his own creation. The key to understanding this, according to the psychological lens we are using, lies in the concept of consciousness. At this point in his mythological development, Yahweh operates from a state that can be described as pre-conscious or unconscious. This does not imply a lack of intelligence or power, but a state of being where internal opposites can exist side by side without cancelling each other out, because there is no central, reflective ego to perceive their contradiction. Jung describes this state with breathtaking clarity in Answer to Job. Insight existed along with obtuseness, loving kindness along with cruelty, creative power along with destructiveness. Everything was there, and none of these qualities was an obstacle to the other. Imagine a storm. A storm can bring life-giving rain and destructive lightning in the same moment. We do not call the storm evil, we recognize it as a dynamic system of powerful, uncoordinated forces, Or consider the logic of a financial market that creates immense wealth for some while simultaneously devastating the careful saver. This is the psychological portrait of Yahweh at this stage. His love is as real and potent as his wrath. His creative genius is as present as his capacity for destruction. This state, which contains all things without synthesizing them, has a direct and startling consequence. Jung concludes that such a condition is only conceivable either when no reflecting consciousness is present at all, or when the capacity for reflection is very feeble and a more or less adventitious phenomenon. A condition of this sort can only be described as amoral. This is a crucial distinction. The divine psyche here is presented as amoral, existing prior to the categories of good and evil. Morality is a product of reflection. It is the fruit of self-awareness, the ability to question one's own motives and actions against a standard of value. A being who acts purely from instinct, from the raw impulse of his contradictory nature, operates without this internal judge. A prime example of this internal disarray, as Jung points out, is that Yahweh regrets having created human beings, although in his omniscience he must have known all along what would happen to them. This is not the action of an integrated conscious being, but of a purely phenomenal power that acts and then reacts to its actions with surprise, as if it were a stranger to itself. It is here that another, more ancient and radical heresy whispers its explanation. The Gnostic traditions of the early Christian era proposed a chilling alternative, that this flawed, jealous and unconscious creator was not the ultimate God at all, but a lesser, ignorant artisan, a demiurge, who fashioned the material world in a state of arrogant blindness, unaware of the true transcendent reality beyond him. From this perspective, Yahweh's behavior is not a paradox to be solved, but the expected, incompetent tyranny of a subordinate cosmic power. This psychological diagnosis finds ample support in the scriptural accounts that precede Job. In the book of Exodus, chapter 34, Yahweh declares his own nature, stating, "You shall worship no other God, for the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God." His jealousy is not presented as a flaw, but as an essential component of his being. It is a raw, unmediated emotional fact. This portrait is sharpened when we contrast it with other divine figures. Jung points to the example of the Greek god Zeus. He writes, "Father Zeus is certainly a figure, but not a personality." Zeus was a cosmic manager, a king who allowed the universe to run its course and punished those who upset the established order. His relationship with humanity was largely detached. The experience of Yahweh is entirely different. Jung continues, Yahweh, on the other hand, was interested in man. Human beings were a matter of first-rate importance to him. He needed them as they needed him, urgently and personally. Herein lies the seed of all the beauty and all the terror to come. Yahweh is far from a distant philosophical God or principle. He is an engaged, emotional, and profoundly personal God. He is bound to humanity in a relationship of immense need and unprecedented intimacy. His consciousness, in a way, is entangled with ours, whether we like it or not. This is why our actions matter so deeply to him. It is why our faithfulness is so essential, and our perceived betrayal so inflammatory. And sometimes even being the most moral people on earth won't save us from his wrath. And so the stage is set. We have a portrait of the divine as a swirling, unintegrated totality of opposites, a being of immense power, operating without the compass of self-reflection, a personality defined by raw emotional honesty, and a deep, consuming need for his human counterpart. As Jung writes in answer to Job, Yahweh is the picture of a God who knew no moderation in his emotions and suffered precisely from this lack of moderation. He himself admitted that he was eaten up with rage and jealousy and that this knowledge was painful to him. This psychological neediness is the key to his personality. Jung observes that Yahweh is like a personality who can only convince himself that he exists through his relation to an object. Without humanity to reflect his existence back at him, he is lost. This is why it was so important for him to be praised as just, and why he is so sensitive to the slightest criticism. Jung writes, loudly as his power resounds through the universe, the basis of its existence is correspondingly slender, for it needs conscious reflection in order to exist in reality. Existence is only real when it is conscious to somebody. The terror of this dependency is immense. Jung invites us to imagine what would happen if humanity decided to withhold its praise. One can imagine what would happen if this assembly suddenly decided to stop the applause. There would be a state of high excitation, with outbursts of blind destructive rage, then a withdrawal into hellish loneliness and the torture of non-existence. Thus, Jung describes a volatile power source that requires a human container to keep from imploding. But here we must pause and ask a more dangerous question, a question one might pose with a philosopher's hammer. What is the value of such a God? Is this portrait of a deity, consumed by jealousy, in constant need of praise, and prone to fits of destructive rage, a portrait of the highest power? Or is it the portrait of the ultimate tyrant, a being whose power is a sickness, whose neediness is a weakness, and whose relationship with humanity is one of cosmic vampirism? A noble soul creates from a surplus of strength and gives without demanding return. A sick soul demands worship to quiet its inner turmoil. Or did you invert what true virtue means? This is the being that Job, a man of integrity, a man who believes in a just and moral cosmic order, is about to encounter directly. And it's not what he expected. It is in the collision between Job's conscious sense of justice and Yahweh's amoral, unconscious reality that the great drama will unfold, forcing a change not only in a man, but in the nature of Yahweh himself. Yet, even in this portrait of unconsciousness, we must not forget the other side of the paradox. For as much as this nature is prone to rage, it is also the source of all beauty. Jung observes that it is probably for this reason that all pristine things have a touching, magical beauty. For in its nascent state, each thing after its kind is the most precious, the most desirable, the tenderest thing in the world, being a reflection of the infinite love and goodness of the Creator. It is the collision of this pristine goodness with its own dark opposite that makes the story so tragic and so necessary. And the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil?" These words, recorded in the first chapter of the book of Job, transport us from the earthly realm of our suffering protagonist to the majestic halls of heaven. We are eyewitnesses to a scene in the divine council. The sons of God, the Bene Elohim, present themselves before Yahweh, and among them, unremarked and unchastised, is a figure named Satan. To our modern ears, conditioned by centuries of theology, his name alone signifies the ultimate adversary and the principle of absolute evil. But here, in this more ancient context, his role is more ambiguous and far more psychologically interesting. He is not a rival monarch ruling a fiery underworld, but a functionary in the celestial court, a roving agent whose title, Hashatan, translates to the accuser or the adversary. His role is that of a cosmic prosecutor, a spirit of contradiction who tests the limits of piety and disputes everything we thought we knew about ourselves and the world. The crucial insight that Carl Jung offers in answer to Job is that this heavenly scene can be understood as an externalized depiction of an internal divine event. Satan is not an external agent tempting God, but a new development within God. He gives voice to a flicker of doubt, a cynical and critical thought that has begun to stir in the unconscious depths of the divine personality. This is the same inner voice of doubt that every creator, every leader, every person who has built something of value sometimes hears in the quiet of the night. The whisper that asks, is it really that good? Is their loyalty truly genuine? Are they sincere? Jung writes that it is amazing to see how Yahweh, quite without reason, had let himself be influenced by one of his sons, by a doubting thought, and made unsure of Job's faithfulness. This is the key. Yahweh, who in his omniscience must know Job's unwavering integrity, is nevertheless swayed. Why? Because the doubt voiced by Satan is an elaboration of a doubt that already exists within Yahweh. The psychological mechanism at play here is projection. When an internal conflict is too uncomfortable to acknowledge, we often project it onto someone else. We see in others the flaws we cannot face in ourselves. Jung suggests that this is precisely what is happening within the divine psyche. He observes that Yahweh's readiness to deliver Job into Satan's murderous hands, and that he doubts Job precisely because he projects his own tendency to unfaithfulness upon a scapegoat. At this time in the mythological drama, Yahweh's own relationship with his chosen people, Israel, is fraught with tension, and his unconscious is already turning toward a new feminine figure, Sophia, or wisdom. Feeling the stirrings of his own potential infidelity, he becomes suspicious of the absolute fidelity of his most perfect servant. Once this doubt takes hold, the descent into tragedy is swift and terrible. The wager is made. It is a chillingly casual affair, a cosmic bet made without stakes for the bettors, settled entirely on the back of a powerless creature. A perfectly equitable arrangement, of course, when one of the bettors owns the creature, the back, and the universe it sits in. Jung stresses that Yahweh's complicity here is absolute, and his failure to punish the slanderer is a deafening silence. He writes, "If it were true that he trusted Job perfectly, it would be only logical for Yahweh to defend him, unmask the malicious slanderer, and make him pay for his defamation of God's faithful servant. But Yahweh never thinks of it, not even after Job's innocence has been proved." This lack of accountability is a core feature of the drama. Let us be clear about the nature of this wager. Jung itemizes the deeds that Yahweh sanctions here: robbery, murder, bodily injury with premeditation, and denial of a fair trial. These are not minor infractions. As Jung points out with cutting precision, Yahweh flagrantly violates at least 3 of the commandments he himself gave out on Mount Sinai. And through it all he displays no compunction, remorse, or compassion, but only ruthlessness and brutality. The plea of unconsciousness begins to look less like an explanation and more like a criminal indictment. In this moment we see the frightening implications of the unconscious, amoral divine personality we explored earlier. With his reflective capacity still dormant, Yahweh is unable to foresee the moral consequences of his own actions. He is captured by the fascinating power of this new, doubting thought. The result is menacing and terrifying. Jung observes how quickly Yahweh abandons his faithful servant to the evil spirit and lets him fall without compunction or pity into the abyss of physical and moral suffering. This behavior, this readiness to sacrifice the blameless to satisfy a moment of divine uncertainty, is what Jung calls Yahweh's peculiar double-faced behavior. He sees a direct parallel to the story in the Garden of Eden, where God points out the tree of knowledge and at the same time forbids Adam and Eve to eat of it, thereby precipitating the fall he apparently never intended. Here again he points out his most perfect servant Job, only to immediately deliver him into the hands of the accuser for torment. And so this dialogue in heaven reveals itself to be less of a negotiation and more of a divine monologue made manifest. The conflict between Yahweh and Satan is the externalization of a new schism within the mind of God himself. The wager, therefore, is not truly a test of Job, but a mirror reflecting the divine mind. It is a reckless self-experiment, a dangerous game played by a God who is just beginning to sense his own inner contradictions. It is a frightening paradox in motion, an attempt to prove the value of faithfulness by seeking its absolute annihilation. This act of cosmic injustice, born from a seed of divine self-doubt, is the catalyst that sets the entire tragedy into motion. A tragedy that will ultimately engulf not just one man on an ash heap, but the foundations of heaven and the last 2 millennia under the reign of Abrahamic religions. Let the day perish on which I was born, and the night that said, a man is conceived. Let that day be darkness. May God above not seek it, or light shine on it. With these words from the 3rd chapter of Job, the philosophical drama of heaven crashes into the raw, physical reality of human agony. The casual wager made in the divine council is now executed on earth with breathtaking brutality. The abstract test of faith becomes a concrete storm of annihilation. As Jung summarizes with stark clarity, Job is robbed of his herds, his servants are slaughtered, his sons and daughters are killed by a whirlwind, and he himself is smitten with sickness and brought to the brink of the grave. One by one, the pillars of his world are demolished by what appears to be a series of cruel accidents, a cascade of chaos unleashed from the heavens. The attack is total, on his possessions, on his family, and even on his very body, the vessel of his being. He is left on an ash heap, scraping his agonizing sores with a piece of broken pottery. And in this moment of ultimate vulnerability, the first human voice he hears offers a temptation to utter despair instead of comfort. His own wife, seeing his state, tells him simply, "Curse God and die." The circle of devastation is now complete, spiraling inward from his herds, to his children, to his own flesh, and finally to the heart of his most intimate human relationship. It is into this scene of absolute desolation that his three friends arrive: Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. At first they embody the highest form of compassion. Seeing his grief is so great, they sit with him on the ground for 7 days and 7 nights in complete silence, honoring his suffering with their presence. But this sacred silence is soon broken, and with it, the last bastion of human comfort is breached. These men are not villains. They are pious, respectable thinkers, pillars of their community. They are the defenders of conventional wisdom and traditional faith. And it is precisely this conventionality that will make them Job's most intimate tormentors. Their argument rests on a simple, rigid, and seemingly unshakable logic. God is just. Since God is just, he rewards the righteous and punishes the wicked. Job is suffering more than any man has ever suffered. Therefore, Job must have committed some terrible secret sin to deserve it. This is the cold equation of their theology, and to defend God's reputation, they must prove it. As Jung observes, they begin to moralize in an all-too-human manner, that is, in the stupidest fashion imaginable. They proceed, with the serene confidence known only to the truly certain, to explain to the man whose children are dead, and whose skin is on fire, that he must have secretly done something to deserve it. Their logic, it must be said, was flawless. It was only reality that was in error. This deference to power over truth is perfectly encapsulated later in the book by the young man Elihu, who, siding with the friends, asks rhetorically, "Is it fit to say to a king, 'Thou art wicked,' and to princes, 'Ye are ungodly'?" His argument is a simple one, common to all ages. Might makes right, and the powerful must not be questioned, for their power is its justification. Their speeches, filled with pious platitudes and orthodox certainty, become instruments of psychological torture. They are the embodiment of every well-meaning person who has told someone in pain, "Everything happens for a reason," or "Look on the bright side," or "Stop being depressed." It is the logic that prioritizes a comforting theory over the raw, inconvenient truth of another's suffering. They are trying to force Job into a false confession, not for his own good, but to make their tidy theological system work. They deny him what Jung calls the last comfort of sympathetic participation and human understanding. This is more than just a failure of friendship. It is a profound failure of religious imagination. The friends are so committed to their idea of God that they are willing to sacrifice the truth of a good man's life to preserve it. They invalidate Job's lived experience of his own integrity, telling him that his knowledge of himself must be wrong because it contradicts their theory about God. They demand that he abandon his truth in favor of their dogma. For Job, this is the final turn of the screw. He is now trapped. Heaven is silent. His body is racked with pain, and the human community, in the form of his friends, is actively working to dismantle his last possession, his own consciousness of his innocence. He believed he was party to a covenant, a sacred contract with a just God. His suffering is the ultimate proof that the contract is void, that one party has broken the terms with catastrophic violence. Jung notes the chilling purpose behind this. Job's right is refused, his case unheard, so that Satan be not disturbed in his play. And so Job is left utterly alone, stripped of wealth, family, health, reputation, and finally of the solace of friendship and the security of a predictable faith. He is at ground zero of the human spirit. It is from this place of absolute abandonment, with nothing left to lose, that he will be forced to find a new voice. It will not be the polite voice of piety he has known his whole life. It will be the raw, defiant, and revolutionary voice of a man who dares to put God himself on trial. But I would speak to the Almighty, and I desire to argue my case with God. With these words, spoken in the 13th chapter of the book, the entire drama pivots. From the depths of his desolation, from the heart of a world that has been systematically dismantled, Job discovers a new voice. It is not the voice of lament that we heard before. It is not the voice of pious submission that his friends demand. It is the clear, steady voice of a plaintiff. Stripped of everything, Job does the most unexpected and revolutionary thing imaginable. He ceases to be a victim and becomes a legal challenger. He decides to sue God. This is the archetype of every great human protest. It is the individual standing before the faceless state, the whistleblower against the corporation, the citizen demanding that the immense impersonal systems that govern our lives answer for the human cost of their actions. This is the beginning of a lawsuit against heaven itself, a radical attempt to hold omnipotence accountable to the principle of justice. The foundation of his entire case rests on a single, immovable truth, his own direct experience of his innocence. While his friends insist he must have sinned, Job holds fast to the one piece of ground they cannot take from him. As he declares later in chapter 27, "Till I die, I will not put away my integrity from me. I hold fast to my righteousness and will not let it go." This is his testimony. It is the only evidence he has, and he presents it with the full force of his being against the crushing weight of his suffering. In his poetic anguish, Job perfectly captures the absurd disproportion of his legal challenge. He asks God directly, "Wilt thou break a leaf driven to and fro? And wilt thou pursue the dry stubble?" He sees himself as nothing, a piece of dry chaff. Yet he's being pursued by the full force of the cosmos, an act of bewildering and pointless cruelty. Yet Job is also a realist. He is acutely aware of the terrifying paradox of his situation. How can a mortal man bring a case against the very being who created the courts, the laws, and existence itself? Who could possibly serve as a judge in such a trial? Job wrestles with this dilemma, lamenting in chapter 9, "If it is a matter of justice, who can summon him?" He grasps the cosmic imbalance of power, stating plainly, "For he is not a man as I am, that I should answer him, and we should come together in judgment." He knows the court is rigged. The defendant is also the prosecutor, the judge, and the executioner. Job's despair at this rigged system is palpable. He knows that even if he could get a hearing, the outcome is predetermined. He cries out, "If I summoned him and he answered me, I would not believe that he was listening to my voice." He understands the nature of this particular defendant, saying, "I know, thou wilt not hold me innocent, I shall be condemned." He foresees that even if he were to wash himself perfectly clean, Yahweh would simply plunge me in the ditch. A clear-eyed assessment of the character of the judge he faces. From a purely logical standpoint, his case is hopeless. But from a psychological one, this act of defiant insistence is a world historical event. As Carl Jung observes, by refusing to yield, by stubbornly asserting his right to be heard, Job had stood his ground, and thus created the very obstacle that forced God to reveal his true nature. His legal argument is a moral and intellectual obstacle placed in the path of absolute power. The lawsuit itself is a demand for consciousness, an insistence that the Creator must account for his creation. It is no longer just about enduring suffering, but a compelling response from the silent heavens. And yet Job does not take the final step of rebellion that would echo down the centuries into our own time. He does not become Dostoevsky's Ivan Karamazov, who, in The Brothers Karamazov, when faced with a world built on the suffering of children, chooses to respectfully return his ticket to heaven. Ivan's rebellion is absolute and ethical. He refuses paradise if its price is a single innocent's tear. Job, in his agony, still seeks a resolution within the divine system. He does not reject God. He demands that God reveal a better version of himself. Then, during this seemingly hopeless legal battle, Job makes an incredible intuitive leap. He realizes that if there is no advocate for him on earth, and if the God he sees in his suffering is his tormentor, then his only hope must lie within a hidden aspect of God himself. He appeals to God against God. He cries out in chapter 16, "Behold, my witness is in heaven, and he that vouches for me is on high. My eye pours out tears to God, that he would maintain the right of a man with God, like that of a man with his neighbor." This is a staggering moment. He intuits a witness, an advocate, a just principle residing within the being who is afflicting him. This intuition culminates in one of the most famous and powerful declarations of faith ever uttered from chapter 19, "For I know that my vindicator lives, and at last he will stand upon the earth." Jung identifies this as the moment Job grasps the divine antinomy, the reality that God is a being at odds with himself. Jung writes, "He clearly sees that God is at odds with himself. So totally at odds that he, Job, is quite certain of finding in God a helper and an advocate against God." This is the secret knowledge, the Gnosis, that Job acquires through his ordeal. His persecutor and his potential savior are two aspects of the same complex and contradictory being. As Jung concludes, Yahweh is not split but is an antinomy, a totality of inner opposites. And this is the indispensable condition for his tremendous dynamism, his omniscience and omnipotence. Job has now transformed his suffering into a profound moral and legal challenge. He has built his case on the foundation of his own integrity, and in a moment of supreme inspiration has appealed to a hidden just nature within the very deity who persecutes him. He has served his summons. He has laid down the terms of the confrontation. The plaintiff has stated his case with courage and clarity. All that remains is for the defendant, the Almighty himself, to appear and answer the charge. This is perhaps the greatest and most difficult aspect of Job's character. As Jung writes, faced with this difficulty, he does not doubt the unity of God. He does not conclude that there are two gods, one good and one evil. He holds the terrible truth that the persecutor and the advocate are one and the same. And in doing so, he recognizes the divine antinomy as a unified, living paradox. Does Yahweh have some secret resistance against Job? That would explain his yielding to Satan. But what does man possess that God does not have? A somewhat keener consciousness based on self-reflection. Could a suspicion have grown up in God that man possesses an infinitely small, yet more concentrated light than he, Yahweh, possesses? A jealousy of that kind might perhaps explain his behavior, writes Carl Jung in answer to Job. Here we arrive at the terrible secret heart of the drama. Why would an omnipotent God, who knows his servant is blameless, agree to a cruel and pointless wager with a cynical prosecutor? The question itself seems absurd, yet the text demands we ask it. The answer, if we dare to look, is not found in God's strength, but in a dimly perceived, unacknowledged weakness. It is the secret envy of the Creator for his creation. Consider the inverse relationship between power and consciousness. Yahweh, as we have seen, is a being of absolute, unconflicted power. He has never met an obstacle that could force him to pause, to doubt, to reflect upon himself. His consciousness is vast and diffuse like a nebula, but it is not sharp, for it has never been honed on the whetstone of necessity. Man, on the other hand, is the epitome of impotence. He is a leaf driven to and fro. His existence is fragile, his life a brief flicker in the face of cosmic indifference. And it is precisely this weakness that becomes the seed of his unique strength. To survive, man must be conscious. He must be keenly aware of his surroundings, of the whims of nature, of the moods of the tyrant. He must reflect on his actions, weigh his choices, and cultivate an inner world of thought and integrity, because the outer world is so threatening. Man's weakness is the forge of his consciousness. This is the infinitely small yet more concentrated light that man possesses and God lacks. And Yahweh, in the unconscious depths of his being, senses it. He feels a secret resistance, not against a sinner, but against Job, the most righteous of men. Why? Because Job's unwavering integrity is the ultimate testament to this new potent form of human consciousness. Job is not just faithful out of habit. His goodness is a conscious, chosen state. This quiet, self-aware integrity is an implicit judgment on Yahweh's own chaotic, unconscious nature. Job, without knowing it, has become a mirror in which God dimly sees his own lack. From this radical perspective, the wager with Satan is reframed entirely. It is not a test, it is an attack. It is a desperate, almost spiteful attempt by an unconscious power to sabotage and extinguish the very quality it envies and fears. If Satan can break Job, if he can prove that this human integrity is merely a fair-weather virtue, then the troubling light of human consciousness can be dismissed as an illusion. The wager is Yahweh's attempt to disprove the existence of a spiritual reality he himself does not yet possess. He agrees to the bet not to test Job's faith, but in the secret hope that it will fail, thus soothing his own divine insecurity. But the attempt backfires spectacularly. The immense pressure of the suffering does not extinguish Job's consciousness. It intensifies it. It burns away every last vestige of his naive piety and forges his soul into something new, a sharp, diamond-hard point of self-aware integrity. The very act of jealous sabotage, intended to destroy the concentrated light in man, ends up raising it to a level of divine numinosity. This hidden envy is the true engine of the drama, the missing puzzle piece that explains the otherwise inexplicable cruelty of God's actions. The conflict is not between a just God and a tested man. It is between an unconscious, insecure creator and a creature whose dawning consciousness has become an intolerable threat. Understanding this allows us to see Job's subsequent lawsuit not just as a demand for justice, but as the inevitable, courageous response of a newly forged and now superior consciousness confronting its flawed and jealous maker. Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up your loins like a man. I will question you, and you shall declare to me. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? At last the divine silence is broken. From the heart of a whirlwind, a voice that is both terrifying and majestic finally answers the summons. This is the moment of confrontation, the climax of the cosmic trial. But the response that thunders from the storm is not the one Job or anyone could have expected. Yahweh does not enter the courtroom to argue the case. He does not address the wager, the role of Satan, or the central question of justice. Instead, he unleashes a torrent of cosmic poetry, a magnificent and overwhelming tour de force of his own creative power. It is the logic of pure data, the overwhelming force of technological progress that moves forward without asking about the human spirit. It is power demonstrating itself for its own sake, an answer so vast it forgets the small human question that prompted it. His speech is a panorama of the wild, untamable aspects of creation. He speaks of the dawn, the seas, the stars. He describes the freedom of the wild ass, the foolishness of the ostrich, the ferocity of the hawk and the eagle. For 71 verses, he proclaims his world-creating power to his miserable victim, who sits in ashes and scratches his sores with potsherds, and who by now has had more than enough of superhuman violence, writes Jung. This is a display of might, a declaration of amoral creative force that operates far beyond human comprehension or moral categories. The speech reaches its crescendo with the introduction of two colossal creatures, Behemoth and Leviathan. Of Behemoth, Yahweh boasts, he is the first of the works of God. Of the fearsome crocodile Leviathan, he says, he beholds everything that is high. He is king over all proud beasts. While these monstrous figures are an impressive fauna, they are primarily self-portraits. They are symbols of Yahweh's own untamable, brutish, and splendidly amoral nature. He is describing himself, the first, most powerful and proudest of all beings, a king who is subject to no law but his own raw existence. He is, in effect, revealing his own shadow. Here we arrive at the central, stunning insight into this confrontation. Yahweh's majestic speech, for all its poetic grandeur, completely misses the point. Job never questioned God's power. He questioned his justice. He never doubted that God created the world. He demanded to know why the world's creator was torturing him unjustly. As Carl Jung writes in answer to Job, his thunderings at Job so completely miss the point that one cannot help but see how much he is occupied with himself. The entire divine allocution is a magnificent but tragically irrelevant answer to a question Job never asked. It is a rhetorical strategy of immense power. When accused of a moral failing, simply change the subject to your magnificent accomplishments in zoology and astrophysics. The defendant, having successfully demonstrated his ability to create both the ostrich and the constellations, apparently considered the matter of justice to be a settled affair. Justice was already made, but it was not what Job expected. If the speech is not truly for Job, then who is its intended audience? Jung's analysis suggests that Yahweh is arguing with an opponent who is not on the ash heap, but within his own psyche. He is arguing with Satan, the doubting thought that started the entire ordeal. Having been tricked into this morally compromising wager, Yahweh now feels the sting of his own fallibility. To quell this inner doubt, he must reassert his absolute, unassailable power. Jung observes, the tremendous emphasis he lays on his omnipotence and greatness makes no sense in relation to Job, who certainly needs no more convincing, but only becomes intelligible when aimed at a listener who doubts it. Yahweh projects the face of this inner adversary, this skeptical part of himself, onto the crushed and suffering figure of Job. He roars at the man on the ash heap as if he were a rival god, a genuine threat to his cosmic authority. Yahweh projects onto Job a skeptic's face which is hateful to him because it is his own, and which gazes at him with an uncanny and critical eye. Jung writes, "This is why the challenge is so personal and so disproportionate. Yahweh demands of Job, 'Will you even put me in the wrong? Will you condemn me that you may be justified? Have you an arm like God, and can you thunder with a voice like his?' This challenge is meant for the doubting Son of God in his own heart, but Job is the unfortunate human screen upon which this divine psychodrama is projected." Jung emphasizes the sheer absurdity of the scene. One would have to choose positively grotesque examples to illustrate the disproportion between the two antagonists. He asks, is it worth the lion's while to terrify a mouse? This disproportion reveals Yahweh's true motive. He is not addressing Job's situation at all. Jung concludes that Job is no more than the outward occasion for an inward process of dialectic in God. And in this, we find the ultimate tragic irony of the revelation from the whirlwind. In his very attempt to hide his moral vulnerability behind an overwhelming display of cosmic power, Yahweh reveals everything. He unwittingly confesses to the very charge Job has leveled against him. His defense is an admission of his nature. In Jung's words, Yahweh's allocutions have the unthinking yet nonetheless transparent purpose of showing Job the brutal power of the demiurge. This is I, the creator of all the ungovernable, ruthless forces of nature, which are not subject to any ethical laws. I, too, am an amoral force of nature, a purely phenomenal personality that cannot see its own back. He demonstrates with magnificent and terrifying clarity that he is a being of might, not of right. The plaintiff has rested his case, and the defendant, in a tempest of self-aggrandizing poetry, has just proven it for him. I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. These are the final words of Job, delivered from the ash heap in the 42nd chapter of the book. For centuries, this statement has been lauded as the perfect model of human surrender. The moment the proud man finally breaks, admits the error of his ways, and prostrates himself before the infinite wisdom of God. On the surface, it is a complete and total capitulation. But if we listen more closely, if we examine these words as the culmination of the psychological ordeal Job has endured, they reveal something far more profound. This is not a confession of sin. It is a declaration of sight. It is the moment of Gnosis, of direct, unmediated, and terrifying knowledge. The entire meaning pivots on that one crucial distinction. I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. This is the moment of Gnosis for anyone who has seen behind the curtain of an institution they once revered, who has understood the raw mechanics of a system they once believed was guided by principle. It is the painful, liberating transition from belief in what should be to the clear-eyed acceptance of what is. Before this ordeal, Job's relationship with God was based on tradition, on belief, on the collective story told by his culture. It was a second-hand God, a being known by the hearing of the ear. Now, having weathered the storm of the divine monologue, he has experienced the raw, unvarnished reality of the divine nature. He sees, and what he sees is the amoral, contradictory, and overwhelmingly powerful being that Yahweh revealed himself to be. He has seen the king of the proud beasts, and he understands. With this new sight, his lawsuit becomes tragically and immediately obsolete. How can one argue a case for justice in a court that does not recognize that law as supreme? How can one appeal to moral consistency from a being who has just delivered a 71-verse poem celebrating his own magnificent amoral power? Job's repentance, therefore, is not an admission that he was wrong to demand justice. It is the recognition that he was naive to expect it. He is not repenting for a sin he committed, for he has committed none. He is recoiling from the awesome and terrifying truth he has just been shown. As Carl Jung writes in answer to Job, guileless as Job's speech sounds, it could just as well be equivocal. He has learnt his lesson well and experienced wonderful things, which are none too easily grasped. Job's reply is a masterclass in psychological and diplomatic wisdom. He shrewdly takes up Yahweh's own opening challenge, "Who is this that hides counsel without insight?" and applies it to himself. He states, "Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me which I did not know." This is not a lie, but a higher truth. He acknowledges his former ignorance not of moral law, but of the fundamental nature of his cosmic counterpart. He lays his hand on his mouth, formally revoking his case, not because he has been proven wrong, but because he now understands the trial itself was based on a false premise. But there is a third door in this room, a third interpretation of this moment. The philosopher Soren Kierkegaard would see Job's submission as belonging to neither psychological wisdom nor slave morality, but to faith. For him, Job is the knight of faith who moves into the absurd. He relinquishes his ethical demands and his rational understanding, not as a defeat, but as a terrifying leap. He believes that for God all things are possible, even that the being who has tortured him can, in the next instant, give everything back, if only we have the magnificent paradoxical courage of faith itself, a trust that exists on the far side of reason. But we must strike this idol of wisdom with a hammer and ask, is this truly a victory, or is it the most sophisticated form of defeat? From a more radical perspective, this is the moment the slave perfects his morality. It is the subtle art of reinterpreting weakness as strength, of calling one's inability to fight back patience, one's submission wisdom, and one's forgiveness of the tyrant a moral victory. Is Job's Gnosis the dawn of a higher consciousness? Or is it the ultimate rationalization for enduring the unendurable? The moment the creature learns to love his chains by calling them divine necessity. In this moment of apparent defeat, Job's moral victory is quietly and definitively sealed. Yahweh, soothed by this submission, remains lost in his power display, still unconscious of the moral catastrophe he has perpetrated. But Job, the crushed human on the ash heap, now sees everything with a clarity that God himself lacks. The creature has become more conscious than the Creator. Jung observes that through this act of divine self-revelation, man, in spite of his impotence, is set up as a judge over God himself. We do not know whether Job realizes this, but we do know from the numerous commentaries on Job that all succeeding ages have overlooked the fact that a kind of Moira or Dyke rules over Yahweh, causing him to give himself away so blatantly. And what is it that he sees? Jung suggests Job's newfound knowledge is something subtle and profound. He has learned that it is far better to withhold all moral reflections, to say nothing of certain moral requirements which might be expected to apply to a god. He now understands that he is up against a being who does not care a rap for any moral opinion and does not recognize any form of ethics as binding. Is this cynicism? Maybe, but I bet it is a higher form of realism. This is the unheard of fact that changes world history. As Jung writes, without knowing it or wanting it, a mortal man is raised by his moral behavior above the stars in heaven, from which position of advantage he can behold the back of Yahweh, the abysmal world of shards. This new knowledge, this divine numinosity attained by a human, creates an imbalance that cannot be left unresolved. Job began his journey as a pious believer. Through suffering, he became a defiant plaintiff. And here, at the end of the trial, he is transformed into something new and far more significant, a silent, knowing witness. He has lost his lawsuit, but in doing so, he has won a terrifying and world-altering insight. This new knowledge, this Gnosis acquired by a mortal man, cannot remain a passive event. A change has now been registered in the universe, an imbalance in the cosmic order of consciousness. And this imbalance will demand a response, a further development, not from man, but from the God whose nature has now been seen, in all its unconsciousness. The Lord possessed me at the beginning of his work, the first of his acts of old. Ages ago I was set up at the first before the beginning of the earth. Then I was beside him like a master workman, and I was daily his delight, rejoicing before him always. These beautiful words from the 8th chapter of the book of Proverbs give voice to a figure of immense cosmological significance. Sophia, the divine wisdom of God. She is described not as a later creation, but as a primordial companion, a principle of joyful artistry, co-eternal with God, present before the world was ever formed. In the drama of Job, this ancient figure, long dormant and forgotten, is about to make a necessary and dramatic return. For the confrontation on the ash heap did more than silence a mortal man. It inflicted a profound and unconscious wound upon the divine psyche itself. The situation after the trial is one of profound imbalance. Job, through his steadfast integrity and his direct sight of God's nature, has achieved a higher level of moral consciousness than the deity who afflicted him. Yahweh, on the other hand, remains in a state of unreflection. He has calmed his inner doubts with a display of power and has accepted Job's submission, but he remains unconscious of the moral catastrophe he has initiated. Yet within the divine totality, omniscience still exists. As Carl Jung writes in answer to Job, in his omniscience, of course, this fact had been known from all eternity. There now exists an unbearable tension between Yahweh's unconscious behavior and the absolute knowledge that resides within him. A truth has been witnessed and registered, and it cannot be unknown. This is a crisis that power alone cannot solve. It requires something new, or rather something ancient and forgotten. It requires introspection. It requires self-reflection. This is the journey every individual or culture must take after a profound trauma. When external power fails or becomes destructive, the only path forward is to turn inward, to find a new balancing principle within. And as Jung states, self-reflection becomes an imperative necessity, and for this, wisdom is needed. The psychological process of Yahweh beginning to turn his gaze inward is represented mythologically as an anamnesis, a deep and powerful remembering of Sophia. He is forced to recall this other part of himself, the part that understands relation, measure and wisdom, the very qualities his raw, isolated power lacks. This figure of Sophia, or wisdom, is a recurring archetype in the spiritual history of humanity. She is the Greek Sophia, the Gnostic companion of the highest God, a feminine personification of the divine mind's capacity for insight and understanding. In the psychological drama of Yahweh, she represents the perfect compensating principle. Where Yahweh is masculine, overwhelming, and absolute power, Sophia is feminine, relating, and nuanced wisdom. She is the possibility of synthesis for his warring opposites. Jung describes her emergence as a turning point, where wisdom reveals herself as a friendly helper, an advocate against Yahweh, and shows them the bright side, the kind, just, and amiable aspect of their God. She is the inner voice that begins to soften the divine tyrant, revealing a path away from pure amoral power toward conscious relationship. This inner turn, this new dialogue with wisdom, leads Yahweh to a devastating and inescapable conclusion. The gap between his own actions and the moral consciousness of his creature Job is now too vast to ignore. The only way to repair this cosmic rift is for the Creator to bridge it himself. The Incarnation, so often presented as a benevolent gift, is here reframed as a psychological and moral necessity. It is an act of cosmic repair. Jung states the case with arresting clarity. Yahweh must become man precisely because he has done man a wrong. He, the guardian of justice, knows that every wrong must be expiated, and wisdom knows that moral law is above even him. Because his creature has surpassed him, he must regenerate himself. It seems that after the unfortunate affair with his most faithful servant and a few centuries of quiet consultation with Sophia, the Almighty concluded that the only adequate way to compensate for the damages was to become human and arrange for his execution. One cannot fault the grandeur of the gesture. The divine drama on the ash heap has forced an even greater drama in the halls of heaven. The unconscious God, wounded by the quiet, knowing gaze of a mortal, is now compelled by the truth of his own forgotten wisdom to undertake the most radical transformation imaginable. To heal the wound in the world and the deeper wound within himself, he must close the gap between creator and creature. He must descend from the whirlwind and be born into the world of dust and ashes. He must become human. To put it in Jung's terms, the immediate cause of the Incarnation lies in Job's elevation, and its purpose is the differentiation of Yahweh's consciousness. To achieve this, Jung concludes, a situation of extreme gravity was needed, a peripeteia charged with affect, without which no higher level of consciousness can be reached. The agony of Job was the necessary crucible for the evolution of God. Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. And being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. These words from the Apostle Paul's letter to the Philippians describe a voluntary descent, a conscious act of divinity humbling itself to become human. In the psychological narrative we have been following, this is the direct and necessary fulfillment of the process that began in the heart of Yahweh after his encounter with Job. The Incarnation is the decision to become man-made manifest. It is the moment the Creator enters his creation to repair a wound and to continue a journey toward consciousness that his creature, Job, had forced him to begin. Carl Jung describes the figure of Christ as a symbolum. A symbol, in the psychological sense, is a living reality that unites different, often contradictory natures. In Christ, the warring opposites that defined Yahweh's unconscious character are brought together in a single, lived existence. As Jung writes, Christ's life is a bringing together of heterogeneous natures, rather as if Job and Yahweh were combined in a single personality. He is the living synthesis of the divine and the human, of absolute power and absolute suffering. He represents the psychological goal of every mature human being, the capacity to be both strong and vulnerable, to act with power, while remaining open to the reality of suffering. We can see both aspects of this synthesis in the gospel narratives. On the one hand, Christ is the Son of God, a continuation of the Yahwistic will. He speaks with divine authority, performs miracles that suspend the laws of nature, and knows his intimate connection to the Father. He is the light of the world, the revelation of the divine in human form. On the other hand, he is the Son of Man, the heir to the legacy of Job. He is the suffering servant, a man of sorrows acquainted with grief. He is betrayed, abandoned by his friends, and subjected to a brutal, unjust punishment. And in his final moments on the cross, he utters the ultimate cry of the righteous sufferer, the cry that echoes Job's own desolation, my God, why have you forsaken me?" In this moment, the experience of Job is no longer happening to a creature under God. It is happening within the divine being itself. The torment of the ash heap has ascended to the wood of the cross. Alongside this synthesis, another crucial metaphysical event occurs. In the Gospel of Luke, Christ has a vision and declares, "I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven." For Jung, this is a moment of immense significance. It is the final, conscious separation of Yahweh from his dark, doubting son. Satan, the accuser who held such influence in the heavenly court of Job's time, is now cast out. He is banished from the immediate presence of God, no longer able to whisper his cynical provocations in the paternal ear. This is the divine punishment that was so conspicuously missing at the end of the book of Job. The accuser has finally been brought to account, though his dominion over the world is for a time allowed to continue. This incarnation is therefore an act of profound moral reparation. In the psychological reading, it is not merely a blanket amnesty for human sin, but a specific and targeted response to the injustice perpetrated against Job. Yahweh, the guardian of justice, knows that a wrong must be expiated. By becoming human and submitting himself to the torment of an unjust death, he subjects himself to his own dark, wrathful side. He offers himself as a sacrifice to appease the very destructive power that was once unleashed upon his faithful servant. Through this lens, the Christian doctrine of salvation is radically reframed. As Jung sees it, man is not so much delivered from his sins as delivered from fear of the consequences of sin, that is, from the wrath of God. The primary work of salvation, therefore, is intended to save man from the fear of God. It is a psychological deliverance from the terror of an unpredictable and dangerous divine Father. But a heretical eye might see this differently. What kind of being must repair a moral wrong to itself by having itself publicly tortured and killed? Is this the act of a healthy, life-affirming power? Or is it a symptom of a divine will that has become sick, decadent, and turned against itself? From this perspective, the cross is not a symbol of strength and redemption, but the ultimate symbol of a life-denying pathology, a fascination with suffering elevated to a cosmic principle. It is the moment God himself, in his profound self-contradiction, becomes the universe's greatest advocate for the ascetic ideal he once seemed to despise. This critique gains power when we consider the insufferable incongruity, Jung points out, in the logic of the sacrifice itself. He writes, "One should keep before one's eyes the strange fact that the God of goodness is so unforgiving that he can only be appeased by a human sacrifice. This is an insufferable incongruity which modern man can no longer swallow, for he must be blind if he does not see the glaring light it throws on the divine character, giving the lie to all talk about love and the summum bonum." And so, the figure of Christ emerges as the living answer to the question Job posed with his very life. The answer is not a philosophical proposition or a new set of laws. It is a being who integrates the paradox of existence, who embodies both the power of heaven and the suffering of earth. In him, the unconscious God has taken the ultimate step toward consciousness by becoming the very creature who first forced him to see himself. "And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil." These words, so familiar to us, form the final petitions of the Lord's Prayer, as taught by Christ in the Gospel of Matthew. They are spoken as a direct address to the Father who art in heaven. And yet they contain a curious and unsettling request. After the great synthesis, after the divine has become a loving Father who sacrifices his own Son for the sake of mankind, why is it necessary to plead with him not to lead us into temptation, not to entice us into evil? This quiet petition, placed at the heart of Christian worship, suggests that the story is not over. It is a subtle but profound acknowledgement that the divine transformation is not yet complete. Following the life of Christ, the dominant theological image of God in the West became that of the summum bonum, known as the highest good. Maybe Plato's wettest dream, excuse my French. The emphasis was placed almost exclusively on his light, benevolent, and loving aspect. The dark, wrathful, unpredictable, and jealous nature of the Old Testament Yahweh was either explained away, suppressed, or attributed entirely to a separate external principle of evil. But from a psychological perspective, one cannot simply cut away half of a personality and act as if nothing happened. A suppressed complex does not cease to exist. It becomes a shadow, an unconscious force that can erupt with even greater power when it is denied. Carl Jung saw Christ's own prayer as an indication of this unresolved tension. He writes that Christ, who knows the Father most intimately, cannot help inserting the cautious petition and warning into the Lord's Prayer. It is an implicit recognition of the Father's awesome and dangerous duality. As Jung observes, the possibility that Yahweh, in spite of all the precautionary measures and in spite of his express intention to become the summum bonum, might yet revert to his former ways is not so remote that one need not keep one eye open for it. The most dramatic evidence for the return of this repressed divine shadow comes at the very end of the Christian Bible, in the book of Revelation. The Apocalypse of John is a vision of staggering terror and destructive fury. Here the loving Father of the Gospels seems to recede, and the old Yahweh of hosts returns with a vengeance. We witness plagues, cosmic disasters, and an unheard-of fury of destruction against the human race, of whom a mere 144,000 specimens appear to survive, as Jung describes it. This is the other side of God, the side that was so prominent in the book of Job, erupting once more into the human imagination. This suggests that the synthesis achieved in Christ was a vital step, but it did not permanently heal the fundamental schism within the divine nature itself. So what does this mean for humanity? If God is a being who contains both a loving Father and a wrathful destroyer, both Christ and the God of the Apocalypse, what is our role in this ongoing drama? This question leads to the final, profound conclusion of Jung's work. The ultimate stage of religious consciousness is not to simply worship the good and deny the darkness. It is to become the vessel that consciously holds the tension of both. It is to shoulder the burden of the divine paradox. Jung writes, "All opposites are of God, therefore man must bend to this burden." And in so doing, he finds that God, in his oppositeness, has taken possession of him, incarnated himself in him. He becomes a vessel filled with divine conflict. By forcing humanity to carry this burden, the Christian mythos creates a situation of profound psychological importance. It rejects easy answers and instead leads to what Jung calls collisions of duty. He argues that this speaks in its favor because by engendering insoluble conflicts and consequently an afflictio animae, an affliction of the soul, it brings man nearer to a knowledge of God. We are forced into a higher state of consciousness precisely because the moral code is irreconcilable with the nature of the world. In this light, the meaning of redemption itself is transformed. It is not a peaceful deliverance from trouble and strife. It is a deliverance from the blindness of unconsciousness into the painful, clarifying light of full reality. It is the courage to accept that the cross, the ultimate symbol of the union of opposites, is the central reality of a conscious existence. True spiritual development lies in our willingness to be wounded by what Jung calls the dividing sword of higher consciousness, and to bear that wound without breaking. This is why the cross is such a potent symbol. It is not just about a dying God. Jung points out that the image is completed by the two thieves, one of whom goes down to hell, the other into paradise. One could hardly imagine a better representation of the oppositeness of the central Christian symbol. Redemption is not an escape from this opposition, but the courage to be crucified upon it, to hang in the tension between damnation and salvation, despair and grace. The story that began with Job's unquestioning piety does not end with a simple answer. It concludes with an awesome responsibility. The process of the Incarnation, the journey of God becoming conscious, did not end with the historical life of Christ. It continues. It continues within the burning fire of the individual human heart, the only place in the known universe where the immense, contradictory, and terrifying reality of the divine nature can be witnessed, held, and consciously known. The drama has been passed to us. He also will drink the wine of God's wrath, poured full strength into the cup of his anger, and he will be tormented with fire and sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. The book of Revelation, chapter 14. Here, at the very end of the biblical narrative, we are confronted with this terrifying vision. After the journey through Job, after the reconciling synthesis of the Incarnation, we are left with this: the unmixed wine of God's wrath, served in the presence of the Lamb itself. The Apocalypse of John is the great inconvenient postscript to the gospel of love. It is the eruption of the divine shadow that the summum bonum sought to suppress. It is proof that the schism in the divine nature was not healed, but papered over. The figure who dominates this final book is not the loving Father of the Gospels. It is the old Yahweh of hosts, returned with an almost cosmic paranoia. This is a deity obsessed with loyalty oaths, seals, and the precise numbering of his followers, while unleashing a series of plagues, torments, and destructions upon the rest of humanity that dwarf even the trial of Job. As Jung writes, it is an unheard-of fury of destruction against the human race. The God who once boasted to Job of his magnificent creations now seems bent on annihilating them in a fit of rage. What are we to make of this? Psychologically, the apocalypse can be seen as the inevitable return of a repressed complex. The one-sided emphasis on divine goodness in the Christian message created an immense psychic pressure, leaving the dark, wrathful, and powerful aspects of God to fester in the unconscious. The apocalypse is the story of that shadow breaking its chains. It is a vision of what happens when absolute power is untethered from the mediating principles of wisdom, Sophia, and empathetic suffering, Christ. It is the God from the whirlwind, but this time with no interest in dialogue, no pretense of a lesson. It is pure, undiluted power, settling a score with a creation that has, once again, proven to be a disappointment. This vision reveals the terrible danger of a one-sided consciousness, divine or human. By attempting to create a perfect, all-good God, the corresponding darkness was not eliminated, but simply made more absolute, more unconscious, and therefore more dangerous. The apocalypse stands as a permanent heretical warning at the end of Scripture. The divine transformation is unstable, the wrath is not gone, and the paradox of God's nature remains the central, unresolved problem of the Western psyche. We have journeyed from an ancient ash heap to the halls of heaven, and back again into the heart of the human soul. We began with a portrait of an unconscious God, a swirling totality of opposites, and a faithful man, Job, who believed in a world of moral certainty. We witnessed the catalyst of a divine doubt, personified by Satan, which unleashed a terrible and unjust suffering upon an innocent man. From that suffering, we saw the failure of conventional piety in the words of Job's friends, and we heard the birth of a new, revolutionary human voice, the voice of a plaintiff who dared to sue God and demand justice. In the magnificent terror of the whirlwind, we saw a God who answered a plea for justice with a display of amoral power, a God arguing not with man, but with his own internal shadow. And in the silence that followed, we witnessed the great reversal, the moment of Gnosis, where the conscious suffering of the creature set him up as a silent judge over the unconscious power of the Creator. This reversal inflicted a wound upon the divine psyche, forcing a turn inward, a remembering of wisdom, and a necessary painful decision. God had to become man. In the figure of Christ, we saw the synthesis of these warring opposites, divinity and humanity, power and suffering, brought together in a single being. Yet, as we concluded, even this profound answer did not end the drama. The shadow of divine wrath remained, and the ultimate paradox was left unresolved. So what is the final meaning of this immense and harrowing journey? The ultimate insight of this psychological reading is that the book of Job is a story about the evolution of consciousness, divine as a whole, but also personal and individual. It is the myth of a God who is forced to change, to grow, and to become more aware of his nature through his painful relationship with humankind. And it is the story of a human being who, by refusing to relinquish his conscious truth in the face of absolute power, becomes the vessel for that divine evolution. The drama, in the end, is passed to us. The conflict of opposites, the struggle with unjust suffering, the tension between love and wrath, meaning and absurdity, faith and doubt. This is no longer just God's inner conflict. It is ours. This divine conflict does not only play out in ancient texts, It is present in the fabric of modern life. We meet the whirlwind not in a desert storm, but in the chaos of a market crash, the cold logic of a bureaucracy, the impersonal diagnosis of a doctor, or the sudden inexplicable loss of something we love. In these moments we are all Job. Our task is the same: to hold fast to the truth of our own experience, to refuse easy answers, and to develop a consciousness strong enough to hold both the darkness and the light, just as Job did. The answer to Job is a psychological task. It is the unending work of becoming conscious, of integrating our own shadows, and of holding the immense complexity of reality without breaking. The Incarnation is not just a singular event in the past, a fairy tale, some might say. It is an ongoing process that demands our participation. The stage is no longer the land of Uz, but the soul of every individual who dares to look into their own whirlwind and ask their own questions with honesty and courage. And maybe in that quiet space, an answer will come, not as a voice from a storm, but with the loving kindness we all so desperately need. My formula for greatness in a human being is amor fati, that one wants nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity. Not merely bear what is necessary, still less conceal it. All idealism is mendacity in the face of what is necessary, but love it, writes Friedrich Nietzsche in Ecce Homo. The story is over, but the work is just beginning. We have journeyed through this immense psychological drama not as historians, but as individuals seeking wisdom. The insights of this story are tools. They are a hammer, to be used to test the idols of our own lives and to forge a stronger, more conscious existence. So how do we live the answer to Job? First, we must learn to recognize the whirlwind in our own lives. It rarely comes as a literal storm. It comes as a corporate merger that renders your career obsolete. It comes as a sudden diagnosis from a doctor, delivered with clinical indifference. It comes as the slow, grinding force of a social injustice you are powerless to stop. It is any force, personal or impersonal, that is vast, immoral, and utterly heedless of your virtue or your plans. Recognizing it is the first step. To see it clearly, without immediately demanding that it be fair, is to begin the path of Gnosis. Next, we must learn to identify the well-meaning but destructive friends in our own lives, and most importantly, within ourselves. These are the voices that offer easy platitudes in the face of real suffering. It is the voice that says, just be positive, when you are in despair. It is the culture that says, everything happens for a reason, invalidating the raw chaos of your experience. It is any philosophy, religious or secular, that asks you to deny the truth of your suffering to preserve a tidy, comforting theory about the world. Reality can be incredibly savage. And maybe that's also why it can be so beautiful after all. To gently but firmly reject this false comfort is to hold fast to your integrity, just as Job did. Job's greatness was his willingness to become a heretic. He trusted his own experience more than he trusted the dogma he had been taught. This is a profound spiritual practice. It is the courage to ask the dangerous questions, to doubt what you are told you must believe, and to stand in the truth of your own consciousness, even if it means standing alone. It is the understanding that a truth discovered through honest struggle is infinitely more valuable than a belief accepted through fear or conformity. Finally, the ultimate task is to become a vessel strong enough to hold life's contradictions and become who you are at the same time. The story shows us that light and dark, creation and destruction, love and wrath are all part of this experience. A one-sided life, a life that pursues only the light and denies the shadow, is a brittle one. To become whole is to consciously acknowledge the darkness in the world and in ourselves, not to revel in it but to understand it, to respect its power and to integrate its energy. This is the unending work of becoming conscious. It is the answer to Job. And the hammer is now in your hand. Swing it with love and morality. Be the embodiment of what Yahweh aspires to be. And maybe this is how the next generations will finally be strong and loving at the same time. This is Irevelato. I reveal the secrets you deserve to know, the lives and stories of luminaries and gods, the obsessive interdisciplinarity humanity so desperately needs. philosophy, psychology, mythology, symbolism, esotericism, history, science, we need them all. What we do here is more than one person's effort. It is a flame that we tend together. To preserve the integrity of that flame and to ensure this channel remains staunchly independent, it is, by design, funded entirely by its viewers. Your support is the sole element that makes this work possible. Therefore, if you can also see the profound value of this mission and wish to see its light grow, I invite you to become a partner and a guardian of this work by joining me on Patreon. Your contribution is the direct fuel that allows this project to continue and hopefully eventually to thrive, ensuring this flame burns ever brighter and true. Of course, financial partnership is just one form of support. Your time and attention are contributions I also value immensely. For simply being here and engaging with this work, I thank you. If this video helped you in any way, please know that I am smiling.